We are told that love is patient, that love is kind, a gentle force that binds families and sweetens the bitterness of mortality. But the ancients knew better. They knew that before love was a feeling, it was a cataclysm. They understood that the entity we call Aphrodite did not descend from a heaven of harps and halos, but rose from the most visceral, violent, and stomach-churning act of patricide in the history of the cosmos. If you look closely at the genealogy of the Greek pantheon, you will find that the goddess of beauty is, in fact, a child of agony and blood, a biological weapon forged in the foam of a traumatized sea. Her birth was not a gift to mankind. It was a warning. And before this story is over, before we witness the fall of Troy and the ruin of great kings, you will understand why the Greeks did not just love her. They were absolutely terrified of her. To understand the true nature of Aphrodite, we must rewind the clock of the universe back to the era before the Olympians, before Zeus sat on his throne, to a time of primordial chaos and Titan savagery. The sky, personified as the god Uranus, pressed down upon the earth, Gaia, in a suffocating embrace that allowed no light, no space, and no freedom for their children to breathe. Hidden within the folds of the earth, Kronos, the youngest and most ambitious of the Titans, waited in ambush. In his hand, he gripped a sickle made of adamantine, a substance harder than diamond and sharper than a razor, forged by his mother for a single, gruesome purpose. As the sky descended to couple with the earth, Kronos struck. It was not a battle, it was an execution. With one decisive, lightning-fast motion, he severed his father's genitals and hurled the divine flesh across the horizon. This is where the story usually fades into abstraction, but we must linger here, on the surface of the Mediterranean, to witness the chemistry of creation. When that severed flesh hit the salt water, it did not sink. It began to boil. The creative essence of the sky god, concentrated and raw, reacted with the salt of the sea in a violent, supernatural fermentation. The water churned and hissed, turning a milky, iridescent white. This was not merely sea foam. It was a biological slurry of immortality, a radioactive froth of potentiality that terrified the marine life swimming beneath it. For days, perhaps weeks, this luminescent mass drifted across the waves, a glowing scar on the face of the deep. It was carried by the winds, past the terrified eyes of sea nymphs who fled from its alien radiance, until it washed up against the rocky coastline of Cyprus. As the foam touched the shore of Paphos, the bubbling ceased, and the liquid coalesced into solid form. From this grotesque mixture of violence and seawater, she stood up. Aphrodite. She emerged fully formed. There was no infancy for this goddess, no awkward adolescence, no learning to walk. She stepped onto the dry sand as a perfect, absolute woman. The water dripped from her skin not like brine, but like pearls of liquid light. Under her feet, the dead, salty sand underwent an instantaneous metamorphosis. Grass sprouted explosively. Flowers burst into bloom, their petals unfolding in seconds, desperate to touch the soles of her feet. The air, previously filled with the salt spray of the ocean, was suddenly heavy with the scent of roses and myrtle. The seasons, ancient goddesses who governed the orderly progression of time, rushed to the beach to clothe her, draping her in garments that seemed woven from the fabric of dawn and sunset. They were not just dressing a queen. They were containing a nuclear reactor of desire within the safety of civilization. This specific origin story, the birth from the sea foam, is critical because it categorizes Aphrodite as a cosmic entity, older and more primal than Zeus himself. She is a Titan-level force. In this version, she represents the connection between destruction and creation. Just as a forest fire clears the way for new growth, her birth from a violent castration suggests that true, earth-shattering love requires a breaking of the old order. However, the Greeks, ever the lovers of contradiction, preserved a second, entirely different genealogy. In this alternative timeline, she is the daughter of Zeus and Dione, a sea nymph. This version domesticates her. It places her firmly under the thumb of the patriarch, Zeus, making her a subordinate daughter rather than an uncontrollable force of nature. These two stories created a schizophrenia in Greek religion that explains everything about how the ancients treated love. They divided her into two distinct personas. First, there was Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly one, born of the sky blood and sea. She represented spiritual, intellectual love. Then there was Aphrodite Pandemos, the daughter of Zeus, the goddess of all the people. She was the patron of sex, of the body, of the sweat and the grinding and the desperate carnal need to reproduce. The Greeks did not see these as separate goddesses, but as two faces of the same coin. One lifted you to the stars, the other pinned you to the bedsheets. Her power was not merely influence, it was absolute dominion. We often think of Ares, the god of war, as the most dangerous deity, or perhaps Zeus with his thunderbolts. But Aphrodite possessed a weapon that made lightning look like a child's toy. She commanded the force of Eros. Today we have neutered Eros into the chubby, harmless Cupid on a Valentine's card. But to the Greeks, Eros was a breaker of minds. Eros was the cosmic force of attraction that held the atoms of the universe together. When Aphrodite directed this force, she stripped human beings of their reason. She could take the most loyal wife, the most disciplined warrior, or the most ascetic priest and turn them into a drooling, obsessed maniac with a single glance. She could override logic, duty, and survival instinct. When you fell under her power, you were no longer the pilot of your own soul. You were a passenger in a vehicle careening off a cliff, and you were laughing the whole way down. The physical manifestation of this mind control was her girdle, the cestus. Ancient poets described it as a golden belt embroidered with magical scenes of love and longing. But it was more than a fashion statement. It was a piece of divine technology. When Aphrodite buckled this zone around her waist, she became an ontological paradox. She became the thing you wanted most in the world, regardless of who you were or what you preferred. It was so potent that even Hera, the queen of heaven, had to beg to borrow it when she needed to distract Zeus. If the king of the universe had no defense against her magic, what chance did a mere mortal have? Mount Olympus is often depicted as a realm of serene harps and flowing nectar, a paradise of eternal bliss. But if you stripped away the marble facades, you would find a political powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark was Aphrodite. Her arrival did not bring harmony. It brought a fever of desire that threatened to tear the divine family apart. The male gods began to circle her like wolves. Apollo composed hymns that were thinly veiled declarations of ownership. Poseidon sent waves of priceless pearls crashing onto her Cypriot shores. Even Hermes found himself paralyzed, loitering around her temples. Zeus sat on his throne and watched this unfold with a cold, calculating dread. He remembered the Titanomachy, the war that had shattered the cosmos. He knew that if he allowed the gods to fight over Aphrodite, the resulting conflict would not just break bones, it would break the universe. The king of gods realized he had to act, not as a father, but as a tyrant, preserving his order. He needed to remove Aphrodite from the board. He needed to marry her off to someone so physically repulsive, so politically irrelevant, that no other god would view him as a serious rival. The solution Zeus devised was a masterstroke of cruelty and pragmatism. He chose Hephaestus. The divine smith was the antithesis of Olympian glamour. He was a cripple, thrown from the mountain by Zeus himself in a fit of rage, leaving him with a club foot and a permanent limp. He lived in the bowels of volcanoes, his skin permanently stained with soot, his body a map of scars and burns. By forcing the goddess of beauty to marry the god of the ugly, Zeus achieved a perfect, cynical balance. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of grotesque contrast. Hephaestus arrived, his massive hands blackened by centuries of handling molten metal, fumbling with his fine robes. He limped down the aisle, his hulking frame looking absurdly out of place amidst the delicate ambrosia and light. Then came Aphrodite. She wore robes that seemed woven from captured sunlight, her hair adorned with flowers that bloomed spontaneously at her touch. Standing side by side at the altar, they looked like a tragedy waiting to happen. Aphrodite stood there, her face a mask of perfect composure, revealing nothing of the revulsion or the boredom that must have been screaming inside her mind. She took the gifts, a palace made of reflective metals and territories of precious mines, but she did not give her heart. Domestic life for the newlyweds was a disaster from day one. Hephaestus was a creature of solitude and labor. He retreated to his underground workshops, places of intense heat and choking smoke that Aphrodite found physically unbearable. He tried to buy her affection, forging jewelry that captured starlight and mirrors that flattered the viewer with supernatural enhancements. But he would emerge from the smoke only to find the palace empty. Aphrodite was gone. She was out at festivals, surrounded by adoration, starving for a connection that metal and gears could not provide. Enter Ares. If Hephaestus was the stable earth, Ares was the wildfire. The god of war was everything the husband was not. He was physically flawless, his body sculpted by combat but unmarked by the grime of labor. He was impulsive, violent, and direct. Their attraction wasn't just physical, it was a collision of cosmic principles. The Greeks understood that love and war are not opposites, they are siblings. Both require a total surrender of the self. Ares began to court her not with gadgets, but with presence. They moved from diplomatic conversations to stolen glances, until finally, during a raucous victory festival, the dam broke. They began to meet in secret, choosing the most beautiful, secluded spots in the Mediterranean. Every touch was stolen, every kiss a rebellion against the king of the gods. They thought they were invisible, but they forgot one thing. The sun sees everything. Helios, the titan of the sun, drove his chariot across the sky every day. One day, peering down from the zenith, Helios saw them. He saw the two most beautiful beings in creation entangled in a valley on Mount Ida. Duty-bound by the bro code of the ancients, Helios went straight to the volcano. He told Hephaestus everything. The revelation didn't just break the smith's heart, it humiliated him. But Hephaestus was not Ares. He didn't grab a sword. He went into his workshop and closed the door. Hephaestus channeled all his pain and rage into his hammer. He began to forge a net. But this was not a fishing net. He spun gold into threads finer than spider silk, yet stronger than adamantine chains. He imbued the metal with binding magic, programming the trap to respond to the weight of two divine bodies. When it was finished, he rigged the trap above the marital bed, draping the invisible mesh from the ceiling like a spider waiting for a fly. Then he told Aphrodite he was leaving for a long trip to Lemnos. As soon as his chariot rattled away, Aphrodite sent word to Ares. The god of war arrived within moments. They fell onto the bed, lost in the relief of their reunion. And then the trap sprung. The golden net collapsed around them. It wasn't just a physical restraint, it was a magical constriction. It tightened with every struggle. The more Ares used his war-hardened muscles to tear at the bonds, the deeper they cut. They were frozen in a grotesque parody of intimacy. Then came the sound of the limp. Hephaestus returned, but he didn't come alone. He had invited an audience. He brought Apollo, Hermes, and Poseidon into the bedroom to witness his wife's shame. The doors swung open. There they were, the queen of beauty and the god of war, caught like fish in a barrel. The reaction of the gods was not moral outrage, it was laughter. Uncontrollable cosmic laughter. They roared at the sight. Hephaestus stood there, demanding justice. He had won the tactical victory. But as the laughter echoed through the palace, a darker realization set in. The gods weren't laughing at the sin, they were laughing at the situation. The laughter that echoed through the bedchamber of Hephaestus eventually faded, but the biological consequences of that illicit union would scar the psychological landscape of humanity forever. When you mix the DNA of absolute beauty with the DNA of total war, you do not get well-adjusted offspring. You get living, breathing paradoxes. First, there was Eros. The Eros born of this affair was a menace, a celestial sniper with a cruel sense of humor. He wielded a bow that fired two types of ammunition. Arrows tipped with gold that could override free will and induce an obsessive burning infatuation, and arrows tipped with lead that instilled immediate visceral disgust. He was the chaotic variable in the equation of fate. But Eros was the light side of the coin. His brothers, Phobos and Deimos, represented the darkness that lurks in the shadow of desire. Phobos was the god of panic, the sudden fear that strikes a soldier before the charge. Deimos was terror, the creeping dread of loss. The Greeks knew that the moment you love something, you invite the paralyzing fear of losing it. And then there was Harmonia, the daughter who seemed to be the peace between the storm. Yet even her life would be marked by a cursed necklace that brought ruin to every neck it clasped. While Aphrodite was busy managing her chaotic brood, a political crisis was brewing that would shift the spotlight from the bedroom to the battlefield. It began with a wedding, but not just any wedding. This was the diplomatic event of the millennium, the union of the mortal hero Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. The guest list included everyone who was anyone. But in his obsession with order, Zeus made a fatal social error. He snubbed Eris. Eris was the goddess of discord, a deity who thrived on friction and chaos. The wedding planners, terrified that she would ruin the vibe, deliberately left her name off the invitation list. Eris did not sulk. She crafted the ultimate instrument of psychological warfare, the golden apple of discord. It was a masterpiece of metallurgy, inscribed with a single ambiguous phrase, "To the fairest." The moment Eris rolled that apple across the banquet floor, the music stopped. The conversation died. Every goddess in that room believed she was the fairest. But three heavyweights stepped forward to claim the prize. Hera, the queen of gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite. The three goddesses turned their eyes to Zeus. They demanded a judgment. Zeus looked at the apple, looked at his wife, his favorite daughter, and the entity who could turn his brain to mush, and he realized he was in a no-win scenario. He refused to judge. Instead, he passed the buck. He pointed his finger down from the heavens toward the slopes of Mount Ida to a shepherd named Paris. Paris was not just a shepherd. He was a lost prince of Troy, exiled due to a prophecy. He was living a simple pastoral life, completely unaware that the crosshairs of destiny had just locked onto his chest. Hermes was dispatched to deliver the apple and the three goddesses to this unsuspecting mortal. Imagine the scene. A young man sitting on a rock, tending his sheep, when suddenly three terrifyingly powerful divine beings materialize before him. It was an impossible test. Hera went first. She offered him power. She promised him the high kingship of Asia. Athena went next. She offered him glory. She promised him invincibility in battle and the strategic mind to conquer any enemy. But Aphrodite? She knew something the others didn't. She knew that beneath the armor and the crown, men are often governed by a much simpler, more volatile hunger. Aphrodite loosened her robes. She stepped close, invading his personal space. She offered him Helen. She painted a picture of the Queen of Sparta, a woman so beautiful she was rumored to be a daughter of Zeus himself. Aphrodite whispered that she could make the most beautiful woman in the world fall desperately, illogically in love with him. Paris, young, foolish, and driven by hormones, didn't hesitate. He handed the apple to Aphrodite. In that second, the Trojan War began. The silence that fell over the Spartan coastline was not the peace of tranquility. It was the breathless calm before a tsunami. When Paris arrived at the court of King Menelaus, he walked under the sacred laws of Xenia. But Paris was not traveling alone. He carried an invisible passenger, a contagion of divine desire. Aphrodite had begun her work long before the ship docked. She manipulated the atmosphere, the lighting, and the dreams of the Spartan queen. When Paris looked at Helen, Aphrodite enhanced his natural charm until he appeared not just as a man, but as a solar deity walking on earth. When Helen looked back, the goddess stripped away her loyalty to her husband, her love for her daughter, and her fear of social ruin, replacing them with a singular, agonizing obsession. Under the cover of darkness, while the servants slept and the guards dozed, Helen gathered her treasures and boarded the Trojan ship. She left behind her life, a reputation, and her child, driven by a madness that only Aphrodite could inspire. When Menelaus returned to an empty bed and a looted treasury, his rage was not merely domestic, it was geopolitical. He called upon his brother Agamemnon and the oath-bound kings of Greece. 1,000 ships launched not for love, but for honor and revenge. The Trojan War was the direct, bloody receipt for the judgment of Paris. In this decade-long meat grinder, Aphrodite did not retreat to the safety of Olympus. She descended into the mud and the blood. We see this most clearly in the duel between Paris and Menelaus. The two husbands met on the dusty plains outside Troy. Menelaus thrashed the pretty boy prince. It should have ended there. But the laws of physics do not apply to the favorites of Aphrodite. The goddess swooped down in a shroud of divine mist. She shattered the helmet strap, scooped Paris up from the battlefield, and teleported him to his perfumed bedroom inside the walls of Troy. While men died screaming in the dirt, Paris was deposited safely on his silken sheets. But the war was only one theater of Aphrodite's tragic influence. As the conflict raged, another side of the goddess began to emerge, a side that craved the very thing she could never truly have: mortality. She found herself drawn back to the slopes of Mount Ida, to a shepherd named Anchises. To love him, she had to lie to him. Aphrodite crafted a disguise of breathtaking precision, appearing as a mortal woman, claiming to be the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She mixed innocence with a seductive allure that preyed on his isolation. The consummation of their relationship was a collision of two worlds. The morning after, Aphrodite decided to drop the veil. She stood over him and let her disguise dissolve like morning mist, revealing the true extent of her supernatural beauty. Anchises pulled the covers over his face and begged for his life, knowing that mortals who sleep with goddesses usually end up dead. But Aphrodite did not strike him. She told him she was pregnant. She told him their son would be Aeneas, a hero who would found a lineage that would rule the world. But then came the threat. She told him that if he ever spoke her name, if he ever boasted that he had bedded the goddess of love, Zeus would strike him down. For years, Anchises held his tongue. But wine is the enemy of secrets. Years later, he boasted. The sky did not hesitate. Zeus's bolt slammed into him, crippling him for life. Myrrha fled into the wild forests. She prayed to be removed from the world of the living. The gods answered her. They planted her. Her skin hardened into rough gray bark. Her toes dug into the soil. By the time her father arrived, there was no girl, only a myrrh tree. But Myrrha was pregnant. For 10 months the tree swelled. Then the bark split open. From the splintered womb of the tree, a baby boy rolled out. Adonis. Aphrodite was there. She picked up the infant, sticky with the resin of the tree. She saw a beauty that eclipsed even the gods. She put the baby in a chest and took him down to the underworld, giving him to Persephone for safekeeping. But Persephone opened the box. She fell in love. When Aphrodite returned, Persephone refused to give him back. The dispute threatened to turn into a cosmic civil war. Zeus intervened, decreeing that Adonis would spend 1/3 of the year in the underworld and 1/3 with Aphrodite. Adonis grew into a man who loved the hunt. One fateful day, while Aphrodite was away, Adonis went into the deep woods and found a boar, a monster of the primeval forest. The encounter was a slaughter. The boar gored him in the groin, severing the femoral artery. Aphrodite heard his dying groans and dove toward the earth. But she was too late. She sprinkled nectar onto the pool of Adonis's blood, and a flower sprang up. The anemone, the wind flower. It was the perfect botanical metaphor for Adonis himself, breathtakingly beautiful, but destined to live only for a brief, brilliant moment before being scattered by the winds of fate. There are weapons in the divine arsenal far more terrifying than fire. On the island of Lemnos, the women made a calculation that millions of people make today. They looked at the ancient rituals of Aphrodite and decided it wasn't worth the cost. They chose the tangible over the spiritual. In response, Aphrodite sent a smell, a curse so visceral that it dismantled an entire civilization. The punishment began as a phantom scent, evolving into a suffocating miasma described as a mixture of rotting fish and sulfurous volcanic gas. It clung to their hair, it saturated their linens. The social collapse was immediate. The husbands of Lemnos found themselves physically unable to be in the same room as their wives. The men began to find excuses to stay away, and finally they boarded ships for Thrace, replacing their wives with women who possessed the simple gift of smelling human. The women of Lemnos were left alone on their rock. But despair is a powerful motivator. They forged a new order. They took up the hammers their husbands had dropped. They went into the mines. Leading them was Queen Hypsipyle, who held this fracturing society together. The resolution arrived not from the heavens, but from the horizon, in the form of the Argo. Jason and his Argonauts were sailing toward Colchis. They needed water. When they saw Lemnos, they saw a pit stop. Queen Hypsipyle orchestrated a massive deception, telling Jason that a plague had killed all the men. But there was a variable the women hadn't calculated: the curse itself. When the Argonauts stepped onto the docks, they didn't smell rotting fish. They smelled women. The curse was specific to the husbands who had neglected the goddess. To the Argonauts, these were just lonely, independent women. What started as a supply run turned into a months-long occupation of pleasure. The curse was broken not by a counterspell, but by the restoration of the act of love itself. But if the women of Lemnos learned that neglecting Aphrodite was dangerous, a young prince named Hippolytus was about to learn that actively rejecting her was suicide. Hippolytus was the illegitimate son of Theseus and an Amazon queen. He was athletic, chaste, and fanatically devoted to Artemis. He didn't just ignore Aphrodite. He held press conferences denouncing her. He preached that sex was dirty and that romance was a weakness. To Aphrodite, this was heresy. She decided to destroy him. She weaponized the taboo of incest once again, targeting Phaedra, the wife of Theseus. Aphrodite took the natural admiration Phaedra might have felt for her stepson and poured gasoline on it. She amplified it into a consuming, agonizing obsession. Phaedra, pushed to the brink of insanity, made her move. She approached Hippolytus in the gardens. The rejection was violent. Hippolytus recoiled, unleashing a torrent of verbal abuse. Phaedra realized she would never have him, and that he held her life in his hands. She retreated to her chambers and wrote a letter, claiming that Hippolytus had attacked her. Then she hanged herself. When Theseus returned, he found a dead wife and a damning note. He let the red mist of rage consume him. He used one of his wishes to call down a death that no mortal could defend against. He prayed to Poseidon to destroy his son. Hippolytus fled the palace in his chariot. As he sped along the coastal road, the sea began to boil. A monster emerged, a bull from the sea. The horses went insane with terror and bolted. The chariot shattered. Hippolytus was dragged over the sharp volcanic rocks, his body flayed alive. He died in agony, never knowing that his death was simply a point proved in an argument between deities. We have witnessed the devastating cost of loving Aphrodite too much, and the lethal price of hating her. But there is a third crime, a more modern and intellectual sin that the goddess punishes with a cruelty that chills the blood. The crime of disbelief. In the ancient city of Amathus on Cyprus, there lived a family of sisters known as the Propoetides. They were skeptics. They stood in the public squares and declared that Aphrodite was not a goddess at all, but merely a human fraud. This was the ultimate insult. Aphrodite decided that if these women wanted to strip the divinity out of love, she would strip the humanity out of them. She surgically removed their capacity for shame. Without the barrier of modesty, their sexual appetites became voracious and indiscriminate. They became the first prostitutes in history, engaging in intimacy without feeling. As they continued to sell themselves, their souls began to calcify. Slowly, the blood in their veins slowed to a sludge. Their limbs grew heavy. The final punishment was petrification. They turned to stone. They became statues, frozen in a pose of eternal availability, but capable of feeling absolutely nothing. While the Propoetides were hardening into flint, another tragedy was unfolding that would produce one of the most grotesque figures in the Greek pantheon, Priapus. He was the son of Aphrodite and Dionysus, but Hera was watching. She twisted his genetics in the womb. When Priapus was born, he was a monster, born with a physical deformity so extreme that it was impossible to hide. Aphrodite rejected him. He was exiled, forced to live in the dirt. He found a home in vegetable gardens, becoming a scarecrow god. But the family tree of Aphrodite is a garden of forking paths, and for every monster like Priapus, there is an enforcer like Anteros. Anteros was the god of requited love. He was the avenger. His job was to ensure balance. If someone loved you purely and deeply and you mocked them, Anteros would come for you. He possessed the power to reverse the polarity of desire, inflicting upon the cruel a desperate, unrequited obsession for the very person they had rejected. As we reach the end of this saga, we must look to the horizon, where history bleeds into myth. The legacy of Aphrodite does not end with statues in gardens or women turned to stone. It ends with the founding of the greatest empire the world has ever known. Through her son, Aeneas, the boy born to the crippled shepherd Anchises, she would orchestrate the survival of the Trojan bloodline. She would guide him through the burning ruins of his city to the shores of Italy. There, her DNA would be woven into the foundations of Rome. The Caesars would claim her as their grandmother. The empire that conquered the world would do so under the banner of the goddess of love. It is the ultimate twist. The goddess of chaos became the matriarch of Roman order. She proved that at the heart of every civilization, beneath the laws and the legions, lies the beating, bloody heart of passion. We tell ourselves that we have evolved. We tell ourselves that we are rational creatures, governed by logic, science, and apps that quantify our compatibility. We swipe left, we swipe right. We treat love like a shopping list. We think we have tamed the beast. But the story of Aphrodite is a mirror that shows us our own terrified reflection. Here is the haunting realization. We didn't tame love. We just sterilized it. We built a world like the Propoetides, a world of commodities, of no strings attached, of digital intimacy without risk. We scoff at the madness of the ancients, at their obsession with curses and potions. But look at the mental health crisis of the modern world. Look at the loneliness epidemic. We have traded the dangerous surrender of Aphrodite for the safety of control, and in doing so, we have turned ourselves into stone. The irony is that the monsters of this story, the obsessive Phaedra, the deformed Priapus, the traumatized Myrrha, were the ones who felt the most. They were destroyed by the intensity of their humanity. We, in our safety, are slowly losing ours. We are becoming the Propoetides, hardening into statues with smartphones in our hands, waiting for a connection we are too afraid to truly make. So I leave you with this binary choice. Do you want the safe love of the modern world, efficient, painless, and utterly hollow? Or do you dare to invite the ancient love, the kind that might break you, the kind that might ruin your life, but the only kind that will make you feel like you are actually alive? Choose carefully, because if you choose the safety of the stone, you might never wake up. But if you choose the madness, well, Anteros is watching, and he keeps his receipts.